Okay, so I am among the people who is dancing around with maybe not the best connectivity today, but I will try to be present in the video. And if that doesn't work, then I'll cut out my screen. And if that doesn't work, then we have some other plans. So we're getting started with, as Glenn said, the nitty gritty of actually managing. It's been important to provide some context of, knowing your forest, knowing your objectives and all that. But now we want to help you start figuring out how to get things done. And so the first section that we're on today is vegetation management, also often referred to as weed control. And the terms are fairly interchangeable, but they do have some differences. They're similar, but sort of in degrees. I think of vegetation management more as part of the integrated pest management approach to dealing with weeds and undesirable vegetation, where it really is a sort of a sliding scale of intensivity, of how intensively you want to try to shift the vegetation according to what your objectives are, what you're trying to accomplish. And so in some cases, we may be happy just suppressing certain plants. And so we're managing them to be less competitive or less problematic in some way. And in other cases, we're really interested in very much controlling that species, meaning killing it, eliminating it from the place. And so keeping that in mind is an important part of our conversation and what we're trying to cover here. In our pre-class preparation that we sent to you, we included some readings, some very practical and hopefully applied resources and information. Likely some of it was addressing familiar situations and hopefully seemed very, very helpful to you. But since this is really a survey class, as we talked about earlier, what we want to help you do is, expand your awareness and understanding of these different issues, make you think about it in a little different way, and also provide something of a framework to help you think about your different management choices and the framework into which you can put information and have it relate and apply to the situation that you're working on. And so we're going to be looking at the vegetation management today from that broader perspective, looking at some of these key points, getting you to think about why and when might we want to be doing vegetation management, getting you to think about what it is that you're managing. What are the weeds or the other plants that you're trying to control in some way? What methods in a broad brush situation, what methods are there? How do herbicides work? Which often explains why they don't, if we aren't applying them in a way which fits in with what they were designed or what it is that they can do. We'll talk a little bit, or certainly you will talk about some common weed issues and management strategies. And we want to remember that this, like most of the rest of the things we're going to be talking about in the next 2 weeks, brings up or often falls under the Oregon Forest Protection Laws. So there's regulatory issues that you need to be aware of in some of your choices of weed control. So that's sort of the framework to go along with the more applied things that you already saw and looked at in the reading. And what I didn't put here, what isn't really included, is precise prescriptions. We're not going to be saying, oh, that you should be spraying, you have this weed, it's best controlled, with these chemicals or anything like that. That is not the purpose of this introductory class. Okay, so we're going to take that list and break it down into some smaller sections that we can talk about, and look through them and think about how it applies to your decisions and what you want to accomplish in your veg management approach. And the first thing to think about that wasn't really addressed anywhere real directly is why and when might you want to be doing vegetation management. Clearly, one is when you're planting and establishing seedlings. And so in many ways, this veg management section is just part of the second section, which Glenn is going to do, because that's one of the more important times and one of the more essential times to understand and be able to do weed control and or vegetation management. And so we often include them, but there are other times and reasons. Invasive species, which may be a problem in your planting establishment, such as that beautiful yellow flower that I had in the previous slide. Scotch broom is terrible for all sorts of reasons, including planting establishment. But as an invasive species, it might also be undermining a lot of your other objectives for restoring a prairie, a oak habitat, providing some sort of habitat, native plant habitat. So there are a whole bunch of different reasons that you might be wanting or needing to do weed control, vegetation management, and those reasons are going to affect a lot of the other decisions that you make about how, where on that scale of intensive engagement you want to be on and so forth. So that's one thing to think about. The other is the importance of knowing what it is that you're trying to manage. Certainly, if you're growing Douglas fir in a plantation, you need to know about the plant that you're growing as a crop, or your desired species, know something about their behavior. And we started talking about that, and we'll be talking about that during planting, thinking of where they do well and so forth. But we also need to know about the competitors that we want to control or suppress. You might want to really control a lot of the invasive annual and perennial grasses that come in, steal the moisture from your seedlings, from their space, which they need to survive the first season. But you might be happy just suppressing some of the shrubs that were there naturally, part of the native plant community of the previous forest that we'll say was harvested, because you might really want them there later. You don't need to eliminate them. So you need to be knowing a lot about that plant community that you have. Where do they fall in the category of weediness from something which has, you don't need it there at all, Scotch broom, to something which is maybe, like snowberry or something like that, that may be competitive at a moment and less competitive later. Or also plants depends a lot if they're an annual, a perennial, a broadleaf, a grass, or a shrub. So all those things come together to inform you as to what it is or how it might be best approached for you. So I have here an example. Some of you may recognize this plant. Unfortunately, it's very abundant in parts of the Willamette Valley. Here in the Mid-Valley, it certainly is. I swear I can hear at least a couple of you saying false brome and some rude words that happily the mics are off. So false brome is also a genus Brachypodium, is a non-native invasive grass, came from Europe or Eurasia quite some time ago. It's well established in the Willamette Valley. Everyone looks at it as a weed. Livestock won't eat it and so forth. It's really, so it can be a weed in planting establishment, out in a clear cut or forest, but it's pretty easily handled along with our other weed issues. But it can be competitive, but it's a very shade tolerant. It's unusual as a grass being really shade tolerant. And so we often find it creeping into our native woodlands, forests, and really it's very competitive, taking over in the understory. And as something moving into an area being managed for habitat, it's very damaging and much harder to deal with. So some of its characteristics, I say it's a non-native perennial, very shade tolerant species. So it can grow in places where we often don't have a lot of weedy species competing with our native plants. It can completely outcompete many understory flowering plants, a lot of the lovely spring flowers that we see now. And so it is susceptible to spot treatments of several foliar herbicides, but in doing so, you may have to be making some choices about when to do it so that you're not also harming the plant community that you're trying to protect. So recognizing it, knowing something about its behavior. The little box there, the little wire square shows that there's actually 2 generations there. You have the large mature plants, and they set seed kind of late and they just drop down. So it doesn't tend to, it's not something that blows around like thistle, but it drops down, forms a very dense mat in a place, and then it's often carried by water along roadsides or by wildlife. So knowing something about it lets you start planning some of your intervention strategy according to what it is you're trying to accomplish. So that was just a quick introduction. Now, another set of points to really think about has to do with some choices you have. So thinking about some of the different methods. And one of the first readings or one of the first resources we gave you was a publication, Nature that talked about some of these different options that one has: chemical, mechanical, manual, biological. Not all of them are available for all species, but there are different approaches individually or collective that a person can use, which is again going to be appropriate according to some of the things we talked about in the false brome example. Herbicides are a pretty widespread and common approach that people use as part of their vegetation management, especially, not only, but especially if they're trying to really control a species. Not everyone in this class is going to be interested or does use herbicides as part of their management, but because many people do, it's a very effective, affordable approach, especially in larger situations. It's important that we talk about it so that people understand what safe and effective practices are. So where we're going to go, we recognize this class or these topics as ones that most people have some experience in, probably. Weed control, anyone I know has at least some weed issue that they're dealing with. So some of the things that I imagine might have come up in the discussion, things that we made a point of including in those readings, had to do with things like the timing of the application. We talked about the importance of knowing something about the life history of the plant and how it works, and that often interacts with the nature of the chemical. So when I say how herbicides work, we may be referring very directly to the distinction between something like a foliar active herbicide, one that you can spray on a growing plant, will get picked up carried into the plant and kill it, versus some herbicides that are designed or that are soil active, and you apply them directly to the soil. They're incorporated in our forestry situations. They have to be incorporated by rain, and then they lay there and prevent many seedlings. Usually they're designed to prevent seed germination and emergence. So here I have on screen a couple pictures of a riparian restoration on the left, a more traditional forestry situation on the right with Douglas fir. And both of those are planting situations that Glenn will talk about, where those are ones where a combination of a foliar active and a pre-emergent soil active herbicide was being used to, oops, now I've lost everything, was being used to control weeds in the early period for soil moisture issues. And so knowing something about that, and then if you are using herbicides, the importance of following the label, of understanding that every herbicide has limitations of where it will work biologically, chemically, but also where it's legally allowed to use. I mean, where they're labeled according to a set of crops or land uses. And so it's very important for you to be making sure that you are, if you're using an herbicide, getting one which has to do with, that is labeled for forestry use in the Northwest, and then can be using it safely around the different tree species that you have. If you're using herbicides, we definitely recommend that you pay attention, that you get familiar with the PNW weed control handbook. That was one of the references that was made in one of the blog readings that was there. And because that will tell you not only the timing, it will tell you which tree species it's safe with, as well as which weed species it's effective on, and the timing from both the desired tree and the target crops, the timing that will be safe and effective for your crop. So those are just some of the things I see. Glenn, are you seeing any chats that maybe would be good to deal with here, or should I move on?
There's actually plenty in the chat, so I wonder if you want to address it now or wait till the Q&A.
Well, let's hold on. Let me do one more point, and then we'll do the chat issues. And so you can sort them and get ready
I will.
So one of the things that we'll be talking about from here on out in some mingled appropriate way will be the Oregon Forest Practices Act, or protection laws. Forestry is a highly regulated land use, certainly compared to ag or a lot of residential situations. And so it's important that you understand that you need to notify the Oregon Department of Forestry before conducting certain activities that which we'll get into later, forest practices. And these practices include activities Glenn will talk about: site prep, slash disposal, and importantly, pesticide applications. So we'll be referring to this frequently, and I have a picture of a book which is available online. We tend to hand it out in an in-person class. It's produced by the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, and it's an illustrated manual that goes a long way to helping you understand the forest protection laws that, as I say, apply specifically if you're going to be using herbicides, but also to lots of other activities relating to roads and planting and harvest. So an important thing to deal with. I have some more slides that are just sort of things that I can talk about, but I would prefer to have Glenn read me some questions and sort through the ones that are broadly appropriate. And let's go. What do you have, Glenn?
All right, I'm unmuted here. Well, one of the first ones was clarifying what is bud break and when it typically occurs, because there was reference to timing of activities related to bud break.
Okay, bud break. Well, I was just teaching a phenology class this afternoon, and the definition there is specific and a little different, but mostly the distinction there is if you're using an herbicide around a crop plant like Douglas fir, the resistance, the selectivity of that herbicide has a lot to do whether the plant is actively growing or dormant. And so that's the key distinction. And the visual cue is when the vegetative buds at the end of the shoots of Douglas fir begin to open and unfold, and you can see new green tissue. The moment you see those buds swelling, then the susceptibility of that plant, that young Douglas fir or pine, becomes greater there. And so your danger of using herbicides around those plants change.
Okay, and another comment, which I imagine there's a fair number, it'd be interesting to survey the group, but none of the group was interested in using herbicides.
As we expected.
And I just said that we make sure that we discuss the non-chemical methods, but that we do have to focus a bit on the herbicides because it's so important to cover the basis for safe and legal use, since many are using them. But then what about the use of herbicides and the effect on wildlife habitat? If habitat's a priority, how does that affect the decision to use herbicides or how you use them?
Well, I think you would want to see habitat. Well, a lot of habitat has to do with, as we talked about last time, forest structure and diversity. And so one argument could certainly be made that, allowing a habitat area to shift over to be dominated by some invasive species that you're unable to control with a mechanical method or weed pulling or something, to let it shift to Scotch broom or false broom or blackberries would be detrimental to habitat. But does the control method also hurt the target, the habitat or the wildlife you want there? Many of our herbicides there is information in the weed control handbook that tells you safety information, and you can find it online for different species. Generally, most of our herbicides are fairly low toxicity to terrestrial animals. We'd be a lot more concerned about them for aquatics. Some of them we know have a lot more activity in an aquatic system. So there's a lot of concern about making sure that we don't get our herbicides, any pesticide, into water. Be aware that some of our most important non-chemical weed control methods, such as mowing, are very damaging to a lot of animals, ground nesting birds and so forth. And there's big windows in each calendar year where you can't do that safely without having a negative impact. So there's always going to be a trade-off. I'd suggest you talk to a wildlifer about the animals that you want or likely have in the place that you're interested in managing.
Yeah, and I would add that this is an area of intensive study because of how pervasive, this weed control is. Everybody's trying to, manage for what they think is the most desirable plants, trees or crops. And so there's a lot of good information about this, and you do get pretty deep into it. I mean, the biggest effect from herbicides, let's say everything's being done appropriately, is that you're changing what species are dominant, grasses, herbs, shrubs, exotic invasives versus natives. And often our goal is to encourage the natives, starting with our trees and then into the understory. So that how you use them and what effect it has on that vegetation can change the habitat quite a bit. And there's a lot of great research on that that gets pretty deep. And then as Brad said, the big deal is that, mowing and mechanicals are a big option. And doing that right when the weeds really get going in June is not the best idea for, nesting birds and things. It's really hard to wait and let the weeds grow, but mow it later, and that's better for habitat.
Okay.
There's another question here about issues with weed control with grass growth, and then finding out how the voles and the mice love the grass and are girdling the seedlings. They don't want to overuse herbicides, but they got a large area with grass problems, and they've been trying to hand clear around the seedlings, but they have a big vole problem.
Okay, I'll answer this and one more that I see that needs a very quick answer. Yeah, this is one of the stronger arguments in planting and establishment situations for the use of herbicides, because of the importance that grass and other herbaceous cover has to creating habitat for voles. And, you may not eliminate them entirely, but voles who get eaten by everything are very cautious about being out in the open. And so a weed-free area is often a very effective way not only to conserve moisture for the seedling, but to prevent nearly as much predation. How you do that effectively is really hard. Mulches can be used, including some artificial mulches, but it turns out those artificial mulches are very satisfactory cover for voles, and they'll just go under the paper or the plastic and do the chewing that way. So it's a matter of scale. If it's a very small planting and you can use one of your mechanical methods, physical methods like hoeing, mulching or something, that's feasible. There's no other and it doesn't matter for a lot of these things. It doesn't matter how. I mean, I'm not here to say you should be using herbicides, but I am going to say that a lot of our success in say planting establishment, which is what Glenn's going to be talking about, comes from effectively controlling competition. It doesn't matter if it's done by hand, by weeding, by mulch, or by herbicide. It's the it's the success of controlling that competition that makes a difference. So it's comes down to you balancing some of those things I tried to lay out. Well, these are the things you think about, but it's going to be you checking off which are acceptable, which are at the right scale, and so forth. So I'm going to leave it at that and then slide up to see one more question that had to do with mixing and incompatible. And I am going to refer you back to one of the articles that I wrote just last year or the year before that's on Tree Topics blog, and it has to do with mixing different herbicides and knowing something about how to put them together in the right sequence, not to create incompatibilities. If they are incompatible, you don't mix them. There's not necessarily a way to fix it, but there is a distinct sequence of how you want to put the different chemicals in, the soluble, the wettables, and so forth. And on the Tree Topics page under weed control is a pretty concise little treatment of the mixing order. And I will leave it at that. That finishes the time that I have. And I think took us to a lot of the different points I hoped to bring up. There's still lots more. Some of it will come up under Glenn's section because so much of weed control does relate to effectively, successfully planting and establishing seedlings. So good questions. I'll browse the chat a little more, see what else we can do, but hopefully your discussions were good. You gained something from them, even if they brought up more questions. We led you to some resources where I think you can find some of those other answers as well. With that, Glenn, I believe I'm both done and out of time.
Okay. All right. Well, and yeah, and we definitely want to provide, a forum for this continued discussion. And for a lot of these questions, there's a lot more reading and observation to be done, and you can call Brad or I and go deeper on all these topics, and help connect you maybe with some of our volunteers and or consultants, who can really help you out when you get into the detail. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start my show here, and I think I am anyway. Yep, there it is. Okay, can everybody see that? All right, so reforestation and tree planting is the main focus for the next part of the session here. And I kind of just want you to start by thinking about what are the situations where you consider planting trees. We often refer to reforestation, which suggests that, you cut some trees down and you're going to replant a forest, but there's a variety of other situations that you might have in mind. So I don't want to presume which one is yours, but there are restoration where you've got an area that's currently doesn't have trees and you want to work hard to establish trees, and that can be even more challenging than reforestation, because you have established communities like weeds, for instance, and then interplanting underneath existing forests. So there's a lot of different situations where you might be planting trees. And be curious to learn from you what those are in some of our discussion here and offline when you contact me directly. We usually start with sort of the checklist and the key steps, and your reading assignment. Really hope that if you didn't have time that you go back and consider the reforestation overview document, and also the establishing and managing trees in Western Oregon, because they really cover the bases on learning about the trees and about planting. And establishing trees, whether you plant or have natural regeneration. So obviously planning ahead is really important, and preparing the site, which is a form of the veg management that Brad was talking about, but specific to getting ready to plant, is an early step, obviously. But at the same time, ahead of time, you want to be thinking about what we talked about in the first class about understanding your soil and environment and picking the right trees that are adapted, that are going to be the right thing to establish or to encourage to grow. If you're going to be using tree seedlings, especially now, ordering them early, often 2 years in advance, is really the best advice. And right now it might even take longer to get any large volume of seedlings, and handling and planting the seedlings, and then keeping an eye on how things are going and managing competing vegetation that comes up later, such as the comment about the grasses that are coming into their 1-year-old planting, and the animal damage that may continue several years on. And I just raised this, I'm not going to get too deep into it, but as Brad mentioned, the Oregon Forest Protection Laws, the reforestation rules as an example, under those laws, there are minimum standards. If you harvest trees and remove trees and reduce the stocking of trees, then you are required by law, if you go below a certain level, that you need to add trees back. And the way you look at that is, if it was bare ground, then you add seedlings, which is kind of a fairly common reforestation, just planting in an area that's been cleared or that doesn't have any trees. But what if you have some existing trees, a sapling? Anything larger than 1 inch diameter at chest high is considered a sapling. Well, you don't need as many of those to meet the standards. And if you have scattered trees that are larger than 11 inches chest high, then we add those up as well. And so there's actually a formula we use to help you decide, do you have enough trees to meet the minimum standards? And that depends on the site productivity. So on the medium and better quality soils, which most of us have, in the Willamette Valley or in the foothills, then you have a certain number. But if you're on a more difficult site, in Southern Oregon, or on a harsh site here in the Valley, you might not have as high a requirement. So those are important things to know. Also important to know is that, if you have an area where you are expected to plant trees, required by law, there may be areas where you're not. So if you did some harvesting in an area and generated, a requirement to plant trees, that doesn't include areas that can't grow trees, such as a rocky area, or areas that have existing trees that are adequate. And so you kind of want to understand where your obligations are if it comes to the reforestation rules. And then, as Brad mentioned, site preparation, getting ready to plant trees, getting the site ready for planting, that all really comes down to what is the site condition that you need to work on, what you need to address. So if it's a reforestation after harvest, you probably have some slash and debris, and you have existing vegetation that's coming up. Best case is if there was pre-existing vegetation before it was harvested, you kind of know what's there. I mean, was it a salmonberry, sword fern type of understory in the previous forest? Was it salal and Oregon grape? Was it dense vine maple and hazel brush? Knowing what was there before is all going to come sprouting back in many cases, as well as in this picture, a lot of the weeds that weren't there before. But as soon as you bare the ground, this is just 1 year, first year after clearing, and there are trees maybe planted out in this. There's all these things that blew in, the dandelions and there's some grasses and daisies and thistles and things like that. And site preparation is really your big chance to control this, what's going to come back, and then also maybe inhibit some of the things that are coming back, but what's going to blow in as well. And what if this were a partial thinning and you really wanted to get new trees, or if you had a gap in a forest instead of a big clearing like this? So those are all situations that you're going to have to do something to understand, what is the minimum amount of growing space needed for planting a new tree and giving it a good chance. And keep in mind that the young trees, have a very small root system, and for the first year or two, they really have to make their way and claim some ground. And so if they're in a dense mat of other vegetation, they may not be able to compete in that first year or two. In this case, this is an example of more like 4 to 5 years after planting, and they had done site prep. They even left some slash piles, but they definitely got their trees started, such as the one in the foreground. And now there's vegetation coming back. And is that really a problem or not? The site prep clearly was adequate to allow these trees to get established, and now they're quite competitive. And in the case of Douglas fir, one of our principles of vegetation management is not just about a snapshot of weed control for this particular year. It's about setting the dynamic, setting the course so that this Douglas fir or other desirable trees that you have objectives to grow, that they're going to make it in the long run. And over time, they completely may dominate. So that's the time factor of vegetation management, not just one-shot weed control. Understanding what's going to win in the long run, and have you done enough to make it win. So choosing the right species, of course, is key. And in the first session, we were really talking about understanding your site, the soils, the climate, the topography, some of those extremes that may really sort out what lives and what dies. And so one of your assignments was one of many versions of this chart of the tolerances of our main native tree species. The one we assigned actually looked a little different. This one comes from that publication on establishing and managing forest trees in Western Oregon. This is actually focused on the Willamette Valley area. But looking at our key conifer species and hardwood species, how do you match them up to the site that you have? Is it going to be in the shade? The numbers here, number 1 means low tolerance. It doesn't tolerate that factor. So ponderosa pine does not tolerate shade. Douglas fir doesn't tolerate much shade, but a little more than pine. And western red cedar and hemlock on the other end of the spectrum are the most shade tolerant. And so that's a key factor of your environment that you're going to match the seedlings to. Who's vulnerable to animal damage? Doug fir and cedar both get browse a lot, but cedar tends to be the hardest hit, whereas pine and grand fir don't tend to have a lot of trouble from browse. Who can tolerate wet soil versus drought? Our most drought tolerant species are pine and incense cedar. And the conifers, if you go down into the hardwoods, Oregon white oak is most tolerant, and things like alder and cottonwood are least tolerant of drought. So really understanding this whole suite of tolerances and where the species of interest to you might fit in on your land is key. and that amount of kind of site interpretation that has to be done, that really requires that longer term getting to know your woods and soils, and consulting with experts where you need to. I did mention before that, the Soil and Water Conservation District, along with, Brad and I as your extension agents, are really useful resources for just helping you kind of map out and understand your land and the lay of the land. So what if you want to plant your own seedlings, or order seedlings for someone to plant for you? That's really a big part of this planning ahead for tree planting and reforestation. And now it's even more challenging than ever in terms of the demand for seedlings being very high after the wildfires. So a lot of people need to plant areas that were burned, as well as the kind of ordinary progress in clearings that need to get planted after harvesting. So there are some good resources here, and I'm going to be following up in emails, as we usually do after the class, things that we talked about tonight. The Department of Forestry really keeps a good updated version of their sources of native forest nursery seedlings. The current one just came out for this year. It has a list of the major nurseries that grow forest tree seedlings, and it talks about what kinds they grow, and you can find out about availability. There's also a special case here because of the fires and the demand for seedlings generated by that. If any of you were affected by fire in particular, we have a survey that you can go to and get on my list so that we can do aggregate seed orders for landowners affected by fires. And that's a program in partnership with Oregon Department of Forestry and Small Woodlands Association. We're looking at maybe 3-4 years before we actually get enough seedlings grown to meet the demands that are generated by the fires on top of everything else. So keep that in mind. Just kind of curious, as you're thinking, to yourself, what experience you've had. In fact, if any of you have words of wisdom to share from your own experience, put them in the chat about your experience ordering seedlings and where you found them. And, we did establish a bit of a chat opportunity on Facebook if anyone wants to use that. Amanda and I will be taking a look at that, but that's an area where you could discuss amongst yourselves. And then I mentioned here, what about genetically improved seedlings? What are those? The fact is that most of the trees planted by the large timber companies and larger landowners like the state of Oregon are from some kind of tree improvement program where they've been breeding trees. We're not talking about genetic modification or gene splicing, but they pick trees of a species that they think have superior characteristics of growth and tolerance to conditions and even wood product qualities, et cetera. And they breed those, cross them, and generate genetically improved seedlings. And you as a woodland owner could actually buy seed and seedlings, request seedlings that are from some of these tree improvement programs, as well as the more standard, just native seed sources from trees growing close to you. And we'll talk a little bit about seed sources. There's also then not only the seed source or the parent tree, the species of tree, and also where did the parents come from? Are they locally adapted, which is a key? Are they genetically improved? But once you have the seed and it's going to be grown into a seedling in a nursery, then there's the question of what type of seedling do you want to plant? And that depends somewhat on your site conditions. And so this is a graphic showing the kind of standard menu or spectrum of seedling types. So on the left is a small containerized seedling grown in a little plug in a greenhouse, often in just 1 year. And that tree is probably around 10 inches to 12 inches tall. And then as you go across the spectrum, we have what we call like a plug +1, meaning that it started out as a plug in 1 year and then they planted it out into an open nursery bed in an open field, but in a nice, good quality agricultural soil. And then they dug it up and lifted it for us to plant after another year in the nursery bed. So that's a 2-year-old seedling. In the middle is a 2+0. That means it was just planted in one bed and grown for 2 years and it wasn't ever transplanted. It's a bare root seedling. And then the one next to that, a 1+1, means that it was planted in open bed, then transplanted for another year in another bed, and it tends to have a more robust fibrous root system. And then the kind of the big one on the right is a 3-year-old tree grown for 2 years in one spot, transplanted to another and they transplant them to develop the roots and to give the trees more space as they get older in a different part of a nursery. So what are the situations where you would use those? Well, the one on the left is one that you would plant maybe in a rocky site or a site where it's really hard to get open a big enough hole. It also is one you could plant on a very well prepared site where it's not going to have any competition. It's a pretty small tree, so obviously it doesn't have a lot of roots, and then it has to grow a lot to really get established. So there's a couple of different applications where people plant containerized trees because they're easier to plant, but also, they're not going to dry out as much in the planting bags. They have their own soil with them. Whereas a bare root tree, you've got to be a lot more careful handling the roots and making sure that they stay moist and don't dry out. And then if you go to the far right, that big tree there is really top heavy, and if you planted it in the dry environment, it might not have enough roots to really provide moisture to that top. So those usually aren't a good choice for a hot or droughty site, but they might be great in the Coast Range jungle where they have to compete and there's adequate moisture, and competing for light is a key. We often are really looking at these middle ground. The 2-year-old seedling is still a standard. The 1+1 is one of the nicer seedlings, and most people plant that kind of as the default go-to choice because they're very robust and hardy seedlings, and they often grow well and survive well. So matching the stock type is an important part of, what you do. And when it comes to planting, the general story, let's start by making sure the green side is up and the brown side is down. But really getting the tree well planted, how that all happens and the steps to get it there are really important. And, many trees end up being unhealthy or even dead before they're planted because of poor handling. And I'll talk a bit about that, what we mean by that. So when you order seedlings or pick them up from somebody who ordered them for you, you've got a bag of trees or a box of trees that should be in perfect health as they came from the nursery, but then how are they transported? What are the conditions, the climate, how warm is it? Or dry is it? If you're going to store them for a while because you can't plant them right away, are you storing them under good, cool, moist conditions out of the sun? Planting tools, when you come to planting, is it the right tool to open a hole that's adequate for that seedling type that you have? And then, how you plant them, that's really key. Are they planted right? A little bit of the detail there is that during transportation, you want to make sure they don't warm up too much because they're basically stored. They come out of the ground in the wintertime. We're usually lifting them in January or February, and you want to keep them in that sort of low 30s temperature range. And if you transport them and they heat up, that could really get them started waking up too early, and also maybe cause degradation or disease or mold. You don't want to expose them to the daylight till they're really ready to be out planted. And the storage environment and coolers is really best, and this is the hard part. When are you ready to plant? If your seedlings are lifted in February, but you're not ready to plant till March, lifted meaning the nursery picked them out of the ground and they put them in bags, and then you pick them up, how long are you keeping them in the cooler? And it's really best to plant as soon as possible. And different species store better than others. So I'm kind of nervous right now about some cedar we've had in the cooler for going on a month now and how viable they will be. And then on the site, particularly once you've gotten them out of the cooler and you're going to a site, back to the truck, transportation conditions, and then on the site during that day, you want to keep them cool and moist. You don't want to be planting on a warm, dry, windy day and taking bare root trees out of a bag and maybe setting them down while you dig a hole. All of those things could kill the tree. And then again, the right tool to make the right hole, and using planting bags or other methods to keep them moist. So those are all really important aspects of tree planting and handling the seedlings to make sure they're not dead before they get in the ground. And then another aspect of planting is the density, of course. How many trees do you need to capture the ground? And earlier, at the beginning, I showed a slide that had the minimum standards according to the reforestation rules. And you saw that on a medium quality or better site, we're expected to have 200 trees per acre. If you were to plant only 200 trees per acre, then you're talking about basically a 14-foot spacing, more or less, on average, We don't necessarily have to plant them on a perfect grid. In fact, it may not really be conducive to the best survival or the good establishment. But generally, we are planting more like a 10 to 12 foot spacing, which is in that range of 300 to 400 trees per acre, because we want to ensure that the trees really get established. And if we lose some, we still have some left. We want to be sure that in many cases, planting them more densely helps the trees capture the site and the growing space quicker, so that you don't worry about the weeds or the vegetation management so much, because your trees planted closer together are going to capture that site. But on the other hand, once you planted 400 trees, you don't want that many trees 15, 20 years down the road. And so then that sets you up for needing to be thinning. And if you don't, things may go in a direction that you don't care for. And we'll be talking about that a lot in the next session on stand tending and including thinning. So a lot of folks are kind of, once they've done a really good job of preparing their site, they feel like they know they're going to get good survival. They got good quality trees, they're handling them well. Maybe they can plant just 300 or 350 per acre, a 12 to 11 foot spacing, and that would be about right. And again, if you've got other trees established, then you're maybe planting around them, not planting this many trees, and when you have more trees already there. And then there's some tricks to, on the site itself, exactly where do you plant the trees? And if you're not on a flat, agriculturally prepared ground, you're out in the woods and you've got a lot of different things going on, like stumps and rocks and holes and dips and logs. And especially here in the Northern Hemisphere, the south side of anything tends to be the warm side, and it heats up, and a little tree can be vulnerable to that heat and sun. And it's always often a good idea to be planting on the north side of something that will cause a little shade and make it a little bit more favorable site, not so hot and dry. I was really looking at that out in the burn area where people were looking at planting, and it's completely blackened and burned, and any little bit of shade behind a rock or a tree or a stump was a much more desirable place than on the south side in a burned area. And you can even in extreme create your own shade by putting a shade card or even just moving a log, to put it on the south side of a tree to shade that spot. So you're out in the field and you're planting trees, and there's a lot of ways to do it wrong. So this illustration shows those. And some of the more common ways is either planting it too deep or too shallow. Too shallow is often the case, especially with a nice big bare root tree and difficult digging conditions. You can't quite get the hole deep enough, so the roots might be exposed at the top. Or if you just stuff the tree in the shallow hole, this is the other really common and detrimental mistake in planting, is that it's an L root or a J root, and J root is really common. And unfortunately, even though those are fine roots, you would think the tree could then start growing them downward and recover. A J root is often a permanent deformity that can really cause problems. Either in early establishment, the root system doesn't form and give it good access to what it needs, water and nutrients. Or 20 years down the road, it's got a poor anchor and it falls over because it was J-rooted. So those are things to really avoid, making sure you get a hole that's deep enough. And then how you fill the hole, making sure that you get nice, best case, good friable soil all around the roots, and it's packed in just right. The tree's pointed straight up. You don't have sticks, or rocks or things, or you don't have air pockets. All these things can be important in planting your trees, right? And the basic tools of the trade, generally a good stout planting shovel. My favorite is the far right, a long-handled planting shovel that has a deep, fairly narrow blade. Other folks like the short one with the handle on it. And there's also the famous Hodad, which is a big hoe with a long blade there in the middle that works on certain kinds of soils and sites. A bag to stuff all those trees and carry them with you out in the field, but keep the roots protected and moist. And also showing a tree planted with a tree protection tube for protecting from animal damage. Now, a key factor once you've done everything else right is being aware of animal damage hazards, like the example of the voles and the mice, which is really one of the big bugaboos in planting when there's grass and herbaceous vegetation that provides habitat, food for those mice and voles, and then hiding places where they can hang out and then girdle your tree when you're not looking. But typically deer and elk are really big factors depending on species. Again, with cedar being the most vulnerable to browse, and Douglas fir often too. And also then your own animals if you have livestock. So being aware of those and taking steps to protect your trees from them or control the animals, it can be a really important difference between life and death or good performance. And there's a lot of different options. The photo there is a slide looking down a tree protector mesh protector all the way. There's a tiny little tree at the bottom, and it should have a few years of protected growth before it shoots out the top of that tube. With identifying your animals and whether they're going to be hanging around and cause a problem, therefore how much protection is needed is important. So there are devices like the different kinds of tree tubes. There are chemical repellents that actually can be effective for discouraging deer and elk browse, although they tend to wash off in the rain and have to be reapplied. When it comes to controlling the population, trapping and baiting often is important to keep the gophers, the voles, particularly mountain beaver, which is kind of a cat-sized rodent that lives in a lot of our forests and will clip your trees when you're not looking. Reducing the habitat, just changing the habitat so that, for instance, keeping the grass out around a tree, within a 3-foot radius, or more, so it's bare ground, or very low mowed grass so that the mice don't feel safe there. And then, of course, making sure the predators have good access to your property, like coyotes and owls and raptors that would be eating those rodents. But one of the best ways to ensure establishment is just having good weed control and having vigorous, well-planted trees grow fast and get out of the vulnerable stage in a hurry. And one of the big challenges with animal damage is that if you're planting trees in an environment, let's say it's partially shaded or in a gap, and they're growing slowly, they stay at a vulnerable size much longer, as opposed to a tree that grows fast and grows out of the vulnerable size range. I couldn't resist putting in this one example here. There's a landowner not far from me in the Molalla area, and he's looking at a 12-year-old cedar seedling that's still alive. This was a wetter part of his forest, so he planted cedar. He also planted Willamette Valley ponderosa pine. The cedar has just been browsed every year. It's still there. And then right behind him are the pines that he planted at the same time. Not susceptible to the browse and growing quite well, thank you. So anticipating that issue and doing what it takes to get cedar established would be the key in that case. And often that's just installing a tube or a cage and maintaining it for several years until the cedar gets out of range of damage. So if you kind of review what the common causes of failure for plantings or reforestation, often competition for water and light by the surrounding vegetation is one of the main causes of failure. The weeds get away from you. Poor site prep, which could lead to that. Now, the other aspect of site prep is just making the ground available and accessible for good planting. So if you don't have good access, because there's too much slash and too many obstacles, including the weeds, then trees aren't planted as well, not as many good spots. So that's another aspect of site prep that could lead to failure if you don't do a good enough job. If you pick the wrong species, or let's say you picked a large stock type that's very top heavy and you planted it in an area where you couldn't dig a deep enough hole, the roots didn't really do well, and therefore it dried out faster. Improper storage and handling, planting technique, and then the animal damage issue. Those are all really the common causes. This is an example of a 3-year-old site that the landowner had cleared and planted and called me asking for help, saying, what happened to my little trees? It's hard to know exactly. Turned out there was a fairly poor soil here that doesn't hold a lot of moisture. So the weed competition, grass and Scotch broom that they had coming in was competing for moisture. There's also a herd of deer and elk that regularly traverse this site. So there were some things that maybe could have been anticipated, and perhaps better site prep and weed control and protection from animals may have been needed to succeed in their getting the trees to survive in this case. Here's a similar, another site, similar age, 3 years, much better soil. It had a good site prep. The deer are there, but not extremely heavy. And the Douglas fir are getting well established with this fairly substantial amount of herbaceous weeds, but they came in more in the second year because the first year they were kept down by the site prep. So that kind of made a difference between this one and that one. Or there it is again, the site where they failed. Now, Brad and Amanda, you might tell me if there's anything in the chat that came up.
Not really. There were some comments on, oh wait, no, we've got a question here that says, what makes a pine a Willamette Valley pine?
That's a good question. So there is a species, a variety of the ponderosa pine that is the Willamette Valley ponderosa pine. So sometimes we just call that a valley pine or Willamette Valley pine, but it's actually the same species, Pinus ponderosa, that you see when you go over to the dry side of the mountains or down to the southern part of the state. The classic kind of orange bark ponderosa pine, 3 needles, medium-sized cones. But the Willamette Valley variety is particularly adapted to the low elevations of the valley that are both wet in the winter and spring, and then dry and warm in the summer. So generally below 1,000 feet and generally close to the valley floor and the foothills. And it's actually, it used to be pretty widespread, still some native outposts of it. And we often plant it on a site we know is a little too wet for Douglas fir, and also warm dry sites verging into the oak types that might be a little too dry and warm for other species. So that's the pine. Anything else in the chat?
Glenn, we had a comment earlier in response to your sourcing seedlings.
Yeah.
Somebody said earlier it was easy, and I had made a comment about right now maybe not so much.
Yeah, I mean, so the list of nurseries, that one publication I referred you to, which is the sources of forestry nursery seedlings, that has a list of a good number of nurseries that are really in the business of growing reforestation stock. And they normally have capacity to meet our needs, which are somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 million seedlings a year that are planted in Oregon. But after the fires, there's some estimates that may be 100 million seedlings generated, the need generated by the fires. So those nurseries, the pipeline is not big enough to supply all those. And so we did start actually a special effort to develop, to make more seedling orders, to ask all the landowners affected by the fires that we could reach if they needed trees, were they able to get an order in, and if not, get on our list. So we have accumulated a aggregate list of, I've got over 325 landowners now that were affected by fires that have said, yeah, we need trees. And we're working on ordering those. The numbers that came from that list are 5 or 6 million now, depending exactly what folks are going to do. So that's part of that 100 million trees that we think we might need over the next few years. So I think it's going to take maybe 3 to 5 years to really get all the seedlings in the pipeline. Keep in mind that natural forest recovery from fire would often take more than a decade for things to seed in and come up. And of course, it doesn't come up in a very predictable or uniform way. Some areas a lot, some areas none, etc. So our normal reforestation, where we think of planting within the first 2 years, here's an example on this slide, where we're expected in reforestation after harvest to have them established and free to grow, meaning they're above the brush and the competition by year 6. That may not be achievable for a lot of landowners that are, not able to get trees for 3 years, for example. So if you got on our list, that's good. But so far, we've only got orders for 450,000 trees, and the list has about 5 or 6 million that may be needed. So it's going to take a few years to catch up, but we're working on it. And also always call the other nurseries yourself and find out. there's some, the irony is that this time of year, there's often surplus seedlings that show up. So if you call them in November, December, all these nurseries, they'll tell you they're sold out. And they also tell you they don't even have room to sow new seed for next year because they're booked. But if you look in March, all of a sudden, here's 150,000 trees to surplus. That's because somebody that ordered 1 million trees planted everything they could plant and they had some extra, or the nursery may have ended up getting more than they thought when they dug them up. So this time of year, you can find surplus trees floating around, but they're not very predictable, and they may often be older and not as viable because they've been in storage for a month. So are there other questions?
Yeah, I have one here that is related to the seedlings, and on that same theme. The question is it ideal to purchase seedlings from a local nursery that has a similar geographical and environmental conditions than they will be planted in? So separation of sources.
Yeah, there's kind of two parts of that question. One is the local
40 million seedlings a year, which are probably planted like warehouses, that tree farm, to 100 million because of the fire.
I didn't quite catch that. Was that following up on the question that Brad just asked me? Charles, what was your question? Okay, I'm not sure.
That question was from Brady.
Okay, someone was just asking a question. It looked like Charles was lighting up on my screen. I'll answer Brady's question. So first, the local geography and climate and soil, it's important for the parent tree to be adapted to local conditions. And so I realized I didn't go too deep into seed sources, and I'm going to have to refer you to a good publication on that, which is Selecting and Buying Quality Seedlings, that really explains that. But the general rule is that not only do you want a species that's adapted to the soil and climate, like Douglas fir on a hillside, or valley pine in a wet area in the valley, you also want the parent trees for that to be local and locally adapted, in your geographic area and about similar elevation. So you wouldn't want to take a Douglas fir from Roseburg or Medford and plant it up here, near Oregon City, because the Douglas fir is locally adapted and that's too far out away. So we have seed sources that we use. Now the nurseries, you can grow a Douglas fir from Roseburg, and the nursery environment may be good to match it somewhat with your outplanting environment, but that's different from matching the actual genetics of the parent tree seed. I might be a little concerned if a tree were grown in a cool, moist nursery in northern Washington and just was adapted to those conditions, even though the parent seed came from here, let's say, and then just because of the conditions in the field, like especially with something like red cedar, that's you can't take a cedar grown in a really nice shaded or partially shaded environment and plant it out in open sun. But in general, the main thing we worry about is that the seed source is from the same kind of geography and soil, not soil, but geography and climate of where you're going to plant your trees out. So sorry I rambled on that one, but that's the upshot. And Brad, feel free to help me.
Yeah, well, no, I thought you handled that. It's really more where it comes from than where it's grown, as far as seed source. Yeah, we're getting reports from people, just some of the topics that were discussed, discussions about blackberries, how trees did in the storms, and questions about, things falling across property lines and implications of that are out of our scope to answer. People are concerned that though they have some assurances that they have some seedlings, whether they're really going to materialize or not, it's a good question. And so
yeah, well, people on my list for that special aggregate seedling order, I've been sending emails out kind of letting you know that here's where we're at. So we're poised to start doling out the 400,000 that we did order amongst the people that need 5 million trees, and then the people that are left, you know, that's going to be a few years before we know just if we're going to meet all those needs. So certainly continue to inquire on multiple channels about where to get seedlings, and particularly pay attention during February and March when seedling availability suddenly appears. You know, when they told you they were sold out earlier, and now there's trees. And if you're ready to plant, you have some opportunities, and you should just check in with me or Brad or your local Department of Forestry that time of year and find out, you know, what's going on. And in general, all these questions that we're talking about, you know, key to getting answers and you know, focusing on your situation is to connect with us directly by email. And also it's a long-term process. There's going to be lots of opportunities in the future, and hopefully the field trips that we're really missing are really going to bring some of these lessons home when you get out in the field and share and look at examples, which I expect we'll be doing starting this summer.
So to add to that, Sarah, would be get on Glenn's mailing list, and you know, you should just be communicating with your planting company to try to verify. But if you can get on Glenn's list too, you'll at least be learning something about availability. Communicate would be my suggestion. We have a question here about finding madrone seedlings, and you said the newest ODF publication on sources of seedlings is out. I hadn't seen that. You will be including that in your next email, maybe?
Yeah, what I'll do is go back through my presentation and the references, including that newest nursery catalog. I will email you that separate email following up on class 4. Here's some references, including the sources of seedlings.
There aren't a lot, I don't know a lot of madrone being grown, but you know, some of the smaller nurseries you could call and see about. Here's a question about Scotch broom. Can I remove Scotch broom at any time of the year, or are there certain times to cut it down so as to not have it drop seeds? Well, the time to, if you're depending on mowing to control it, chances aren't great, but you can at least keep it. You would have to mow it before it sets seed. If and there are seasons, you know, early summer is probably a better time that you'll cause more damage to it by mowing, but it is pretty adapted to that. Once they get older and they have developed a single stem, which probably means they've already dropped millions of seeds, then they are actually fairly susceptible to being cut off and won't resprout. But if they're younger, bushy style, they respond quite well to it, to mowing, and are pretty resilient.
Yeah, if you cut the old ones and lay them down to shade the soil, the key with Scotch broom is not disturbing the soil and also not exposing it to sunlight, because that stimulates seed germination. So some people, when they cut their Scotch broom, if they just actually use them as an on-site mulch, that can help reduce the germination of seed to some extent.
Okay, so yeah, Scotch broom is a challenge. Here's another question, wondering if what our guess is, if there will be some flexibility regarding reaping and establishment deadlines due to the seedling shortage. And that probably applies to whether your need for seedling came because of the fire or because of a planned harvest. I think you would need to count on it and communicate with ODF. Communication about that is really important. You have insight from your discussions with ODF on if they're planning to make any systematic changes or process to ask for some extension?
They're not necessarily making any systematic change. I just saw an email about it today, though, that all the stewardship foresters for ODF, who are the ones in charge of the regulations, they know that a lot of people are struggling to find seedlings. And so you do need to contact the stewardship forester if you think you're not going to be able to plant within 2 years, which is the starting point. And just let them know that you're trying and that you're not able to find trees. And then I think that in general, there's going to be a fair number of extensions on a case-by-case basis, but you have to communicate, you have to demonstrate that you are trying before they're going to give you that. They're not going to do a blanket extension for everybody. So case by case, but there's a good chance that, you know, they'll understand and you'll get an extension. And I saw one question here, maybe the last one before we start to wrap up. Douglas fir forest, are there thousands of seeds on the forest floor? Will opening the forest guarantee that you'll get regeneration? So with Douglas fir and a lot of our conifers, the viability of seed on the forest floor is pretty short-lived. Generally, they need a cone crop with new seeds to fall during usually the fall and winter for those then to germinate and restock the forest. So when we're counting on natural regeneration from seed, that normally means having a cone crop within the first few years while the ground is, you know, open and available for seed to germinate. And Douglas fir requires bare mineral soil. It doesn't like to, you know, germinate in lots of duff or debris or in shade. It needs to be exposed, you know, good exposed mineral soil for Douglas fir, and many other species often require that. On the other hand, hemlock and red cedar would be more likely to germinate, you know, on a more shaded and forest floor environment or on dead wood, that kind of thing. But generally from a current or recent cone crop and not for very many years. Well, with that, Brad, are there more questions or should we wrap it up? It's getting late.
That was pretty much it. And, you know, some of them are a little out of scope for us, but I think we addressed most of them at least to some degree. And yes, I think you should talk about what's coming up. We're modifying a little bit some of the things that we had in content, and this is one of the reasons. So.
Right. Yeah. So I wanted to put in a plug. Actually, Brad and Amanda have been working harder on this than I have, putting together with our statewide team a series of fire aware, fire prepared wildfire Wednesdays. And the first one is next Wednesday, the 17th, really starting out with some of the key aspects of what it takes for people in their communities to become aware and start being prepared for wildfire, given the increasing risks that we're concerned about. So there's we're going to send this out too. So you'll have this to click on if you want to sign up for any of these. Lots of opportunities coming up, including this fire aware, fire prepared wildfire Wednesdays.
Yeah, we would normally have like a short session on fire preparedness, and given the intense interest in the topic now, we really couldn't address it. This will be a 7-part series, and each will have more information coming from it, but I strongly recommend folks to plan to participate in this. There'll be an hour each, and encourage friends and neighbors to do it, to get involved as well.
Right, and I see Amanda put it in the chat, and then we'll send this out with our email follow-up. So with that, we just wanted to wrap up a little bit more that we're at 8 o'clock, and so glad that you stuck with us, and hopefully this is helpful. Definitely encourage you to contact us directly for more specific questions. And then we kind of wanted to wrap up. If you've got more comments about what we're doing and suggestions for how to do it better, we still like to get those, and hoping that these discussion groups still work. I want to emphasize that the homework, you know, there's so much here, and we're sending you a lot of really good information through the homework or the suggested readings. And definitely, you know, there's a lot of material there that we don't try to cover in detail here because we want to have a little bit more of a discussion time. So dig into that and let us know how that's going. If you are looking at it, or if you want more references. Brad, do you have anything to add for the wrap up there?
Nope, I think we just wanted to invite people to give us some feedback. I think so that we know if these discussion groups are being effective, and you know, if we design it so that the reading is helpful. Are you doing them, and are you getting something out of the discussions? Would be good for us to hear. So with that, I'll say goodbye and look forward to hearing from, seeing you all back next week.
Okay, and yep, so I'll do the same. I don't see any urgent questions hanging around. So tune in next week. We're going to be talking about stand tending and thinning and a little bit on the forest protection rules, and hopefully sign up for the fire programs too. Very good. Good night, everybody.